I really think it is about empowering a new generation of media leaders.
Hello, and welcome to On Purpose. Today, I'm joined by Stephanie Mehta, the CEO of Mansueto, which is the parent company of Inc. magazine and Fast Company. Welcome, Stephanie.
Thank you for having me, Kristin.
So let me start out with, you started out in college, but not in journalism, I believe as an English major. What attracted you in the beginning to even get involved with the paper?
When I was a freshman at Northwestern University, which has a great journalism school, I lived across the hall from a woman who was also a freshman working for the college paper. And I remember one day, fairly early on in our college education, we were probably only there for a couple of weeks, she came back from the paper and had the front page story in the Daily Northwestern. And I was just in awe. And to me, the idea that you could walk into the newsroom at 3 o'clock on Thursday and then have the front page story in the newspaper that everybody was reading on a Friday, it was like magic. I wanted to know, how do you do this? And so she was kind enough to let me follow her into the paper the next week, and I was bitten.
So even before you were CEO here at Fast Company and Inc., you've been at some of the world's leading media institutions, whether that's Bloomberg or Fortune, and many have really described you as someone who's broken the mold in the media industry. What do you think they mean when they say that?
I think it's a couple of things. One is that although there are a number of amazing women in journalism, there have not been that many women editors-in-chief. And so before I became CEO of Mansueto, I was the editor-in-chief of Fast Company. It had never had a woman editor-in-chief before. I think the other thing is that I have really tried to be a player coach. So throughout my career, even as I've edited, I've always tried to write. I've tried to keep one hand in sort of all aspects of the business. And I think that has perhaps been seen as unusual, because so many times when people do get the top job, they are so focused on the day-to-day running of an operation that they don't often feel like they have the opportunity to sort of be in the trenches. But I actually love being in the trenches.
Throughout that career, you have told some amazing stories, and you've had the opportunity to meet some incredible leaders. Is there any commonalities? You think about the interviews that you thought were some of the strongest, the stories that you told that you think had the greatest impact. Was there anything in common of those leaders?
I think something that a lot of leaders have in common, even though we have only really in recent history started to talk about purpose, I think that leaders who demonstrate purpose or who have a sense of purpose and who can articulate purpose have been some of my favorite interviews and some of the strongest interviews I've ever done. It's really been a privilege to watch executives go from being so focused on the conversation being around, CapEx and profits and revenue growth, to being mindful of the importance of all of those things, but also making sure that they are communicating the purpose of their organization and what drives them as leaders and what drives their organization.
So one of the other issues that people are talking a lot about is trust, and specifically trust in corporations, trust in the media. Where do you see the sort of trust evolving?
Well, it's interesting because I think a lot of what I'm hearing as a CEO is applicable to the challenges that the media industry faces. And so as a CEO, and I'm sure that you're hearing this the same as I am, employees want transparency. Customers want transparency. And I hear that word over and over again. And I realized, and this is something I've believed for a long time, the media industry is actually one of the least transparent industries there is in terms of explaining our processes to our readers and our communities and our customers. Most people do not know how an article for a Fast Company or an Inc. or a New Yorker or a Vanity Fair is produced. They're so used to this high velocity journalism that they read online that they don't realize that there's a whole system of checks and balances that take place before an article can be published in one of those outlets. So I think a little bit of transparency about the process and helping people understand why what they're reading is valued, is something that the media industry can do to engender greater trust.
So as you follow on the trust issue, in Fast Company, you cover some of the most exciting, disruptive digital technologies and innovations. And I would say the tech and digital space is another place where I would say the public right now is, really questioning and has a trust challenge. As you've interviewed some leading CEOs, what do you think they need to be doing, or how can they improve the trust with the public?
It's interesting to see the way that the public and public policy officials' relationship with tech has changed. I remember in the 90s and the 2000s, we had almost gotten to the point where tech companies were a little bit of a shadow government. You would hear tech executives say, well, we're going to send a couple of people down to Washington to help them understand how the internet works, or we're going to send a couple of executives to the Hill to really help people understand, what an algorithm is. And I think that switch has flipped. Some of these companies, I think, are admitting for the first time that they don't have all the answers. They have adopted a position of being much more of a two-way street with public policymakers. And I think that's right, and I think that's good.
We've talked a lot about the purpose of some of your magazines and really meeting the needs of your readers. What is your personal purpose, and how does that link to the choice you've made to lead two of the leading magazines?
I think it's evolving because my purpose when I was purely a journalist and purely editorial was probably a little different than how I think about my purpose today. But I really think it is about empowering a new generation of media leaders, whether that's on the business side or on the editorial side. The thing I'm probably proudest of in my professional career is all of the tremendous young journalists that I've had a chance to, even in a small way, help mentor. I know there's problems with trust, but it's the greatest job in the world, and I hope that I can bring some of that energy to a new generation.
But what an amazing purpose, and one that you have clearly demonstrated as a role model and as a player coach, as you talked about. So thank you so much for joining, and thank you for joining us for this episode of On Purpose. I'll see you next time.